What if I told you that in the second week of testing in Bahrain we not only saw Ferrari set the best time, but we witnessed the exact moment in which Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc changed the mentality of the entire team. Because it wasn't just a 1 minute and 33.739 seconds on the board. It wasn't just a solid simulation. It was something much deeper. It was Hamilton arriving in Maranello and, in a matter of days, surprising the engineers themselves with his reading of the SF26. It was Leclerc confirming with pure speed that the car has a very high-performance ceiling. It was Ferrari going from technical doubt to the conviction that they can fight for anything. Ferrari arrived at the second week of testing at the Bahrain International Circuit with more questions than answers. From the outside, the narrative was optimistic. New 2026 regulations, an aggressive concept in the SF26, the arrival of Lewis Hamilton to accompany Charles Leclerc, and a technical structure that was reinforced after a competitive 2024. But internally, the environment was not so linear. The first week had left mixed signals. Yes, Leclerc had been the fastest in one of the sessions with a 1 minute and 34.273 seconds and had completed long runs of around 140 laps that spoke of structural reliability. But behind the cold stopwatch data there was a real concern. The car showed unpredictable behavior in windy conditions and especially at high speed. The new rear diffuser with a radical V-shaped design generated very aggressive load peaks, but also episodes of sudden loss of aerodynamic support. In other words, the ceiling was high, but the floor was unstable. And this is where Act 1 of this story really begins. Because the second week did not begin with euphoria, it began with a very clear objective: to understand if the SF26 was a truly competitive car or simply a car that shone in very specific conditions. Engineers needed correlation between wind tunnel, simulator, and track. They needed to validate that the data was not tainted by light fuel programs or aggressive engine maps. Charles Leclerc took to the track on the morning of the first day of this second round and clocked a 1 minute and 33.739 seconds with Pirelli's unmarked prototype C3 compound, placing him at the head of the table. But beyond time, what really impacted was the naturalness with which the Monegasque repeated competitive records in different conditions. It was not a miraculous return. It was consistency. He was a driver who felt the front axle was stable, who could attack the corner entry without fear of a sudden stall. However, Leclerc was publicly cautious. He insisted that with the new 2026 rules it was extremely difficult to extrapolate real hierarchies because each team worked with different loads and maps. That caution was not accidental. Ferrari knew that the real test was not in the timetable, but in the long runs and thermal management. And there the second protagonist appeared. Lewis Hamilton did not come to Ferrari to adapt slowly. He came to question. In that second week, their data began to reveal something that surprised even the team's technical environment. His tire management in long stints was especially solid, with very strong sectors in slow corners and traction zones. But the most important thing was not the specific speed, but the structural reading of the car. Hamilton quickly identified how the SF26 reacted when the flow became destabilized at high speed. Where others might simply report lack of grip, he segmented the problem: entry, midpoint, exit. Sustained lateral load, aerodynamic transition, balance under braking. That technical precision accelerated the team's work in just days. And this is where the tension transforms. Ferrari went from worrying about a possible lack of aerodynamic correlation to starting to see a clear pattern. The car had real potential but needed fine adjustments in high-speed stability and wind sensitivity. The second week then became an intensive laboratory. Cross-comparisons between driving styles. Divergent configurations between Hamilton and Leclerc. Rake, height and power delivery map evaluations. What was at stake was not just a good time in Bahrain. It was confirmation that Ferrari's 2026 concept was not a risky experiment, but a basis for building a winning car. Act 1 in essence is not about the fast lap. It deals with the change of internal perception. How a team that began the second week with technical doubts began to close those questions thanks to the combination of two very different but complementary profiles. Leclerc as a natural reference for the project and Hamilton as a catalyst for in-depth analysis. And most importantly, they were not looking to show cards to the paddock yet. They were looking for certainties within the box. The second week in Bahrain stopped being a simple technical validation phase and became something much deeper. The exact point at which Ferrari began to truly believe in its 2026 project. Because it is one thing to set the best time, and quite another to understand why you are setting it. After Charles Leclerc's 1 minute and 33.739 seconds in the prototype C3, the team's approach changed radically. They were no longer just looking for stability. Now they wanted to explore the limit. They wanted to know how far they could push the SF26 without reappearing the aerodynamic correlation problems that had raised questions in the first week, especially with that radical V-shaped rear diffuser that had shown episodes of instability at high speed. And this is where the duo comes into play. Ferrari began to divide work almost surgically. Leclerc continued to exploit the potential of one lap, looking for sensitivity in the front axle, stability under braking and confidence when passing through fast corners. His natural ability to repeat competitive times confirmed that the car was not dependent on a single narrow window of performance. It was not a car that only worked in ideal conditions. He was starting to show versatility. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton became the architect of deep analysis. Their long runs began to reveal something that directly impacted the engineers. The degradation was better controlled than expected, and more importantly, the car responded consistently when the balance was adjusted millimeters in height and mechanical distribution. Hamilton wasn't just lapping fast. I was building the car from the inside. Each outing was a structured test. Differential adjustment. Variation in delivery maps. Minimal modification to the aerodynamic platform. And the data began to align. The psychological effect was immediate. Ferrari went from wondering if the SF26 was too aggressive a concept, to wondering how they could accelerate its development before the actual start of the season. Because when two drivers with such different profiles agree that the car has a solid base, the team's confidence multiplies. But there was a key detail in this second week: consistency. In race simulations, the car did not show abrupt drops in performance. Thermal management, which in previous years had been a historical weak point at Ferrari, was beginning to look more controlled. The pace was not explosive for 3 laps and then collapsed. It was stable, sustained, competitive. What in the first week was caution was now contained ambition. Engineers began to see that the problem was not one of concept, but one of refinement. The famous aerodynamic stall, detected at high speed, ceased to be a structural threat and became a specific area for improvement. That, in technical terms, is a huge difference. The second week of testing in Bahrain did not end when the checkered flag fell on the final day. It ended when Ferrari engineers crossed all the data and understood something that completely changes the perspective of the 2026 project. The SF26 is not just fast, it is developable. And that difference is gigantic. For years, Ferrari has had cars capable of shining at specific moments, but that deflated when the season required constant evolution. In Bahrain, however, what left its mark was not only Charles Leclerc's best time of 1 minute and 33.739 seconds, nor his solidity in long runs. It was confirmation that the aggressive concept, including that radical diffuser that generated initial doubts, was not a desperate bet, but rather a base with room for growth. And this is where Hamilton's impact becomes strategic. Lewis not only surprised with his speed or his tire management. What really altered the internal dynamics was the way it helped Ferrari speed up the process of understanding the car. Normally, that kind of correlation between track and simulator takes months of fine-tuning. In Bahrain, thanks to the combination of feedback between him and Leclerc, the team reduced that learning time drastically. That has direct consequences. First, internal confidence. When a team believes in its technical platform, it works more aggressively on development. It is not protected. He doesn't hesitate. Push. Second, clarity of direction. The problem detected at high speed ceased to be a structural threat and became a specific variable to be optimized. That means Ferrari doesn't need to redesign the car, it needs to perfect it. Third, external pressure. Because although Leclerc publicly insisted that it is difficult to extrapolate real hierarchies under the new 2026 regulation, the paddock takes note. The times, the consistency, and, above all, the naturalness with which both drivers spoke about the car generated something very dangerous for their rivals: expectation. But there is one last element that makes this act the most important of all: internal balance. Ferrari not only has a competitive car, it has 2 technical leaders within the cockpit. Leclerc represents continuity, deep knowledge of the structure, the historical reference of the project. Hamilton represents transversal experience, comparative vision, the standard of a champion who has worked in winning systems. If both converge in diagnosis and direction, Ferrari eliminates one of its biggest problems of the past: internal fragmentation. The second week of testing in Bahrain was not a media spectacle. It wasn't a race. There were no points at stake. But in many ways it was more eye-opening than any Grand Prix. Because there, far from the noise of the championship, Ferrari got what it really needed: certainty. Charles Leclerc's best time of 1 minute and 33.739 seconds was the headline. The solidity in long runs was confirmation. But the real turning point was invisible to the stopwatch. The internal validation that the SF26 has basis, coherence and room for evolution, even after initial doubts with aerodynamic correlation and high-speed behavior. Hamilton not only impressed because of his speed. It had an impact because it reduced the team's learning time. Because it helped turn uncertainty into clear technical direction. Because his reading of the car raised the internal standard. Leclerc wasn't just fast. It was consistent. It was the thermometer that confirmed that the potential was not circumstantial. That the car responds when required. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.